On behalf of the United States and Russia, co-sponsors of the Middle East peace process, welcome to this great occasion of history and hope.
U.S. President Joe Biden has renewed calls for the so-called two-state solution.
There's no solution for Israel other than a two-state solution. It does not exist.
Two-state solution.
Two-state solution. Two-state solution. Two-state solution.
Let's therefore explore what went wrong the last time Israeli and Palestinian leaders went down the two-state solution route. The idea of the two-state solution was an idea born out of the Oslo Process, which laid the faulty foundation for everything to follow. So, let's talk about Oslo. Problem number 1. Many Palestinian political and militant organizations were left out of the process. The Oslo Process, which set in motion the two-state solution framework, excluded Hamas and Islamic Jihad. This was a strange decision by Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, since, for years prior to the signing of the accords, these were the primary groups engaged in an armed struggle against the Israeli military. Hamas carried out attacks against Israeli military targets in February of 1989, May 1992, July 1992, October 1992, and December of 1992, and against Israeli civilians in December of 1990 and June 1993. The PLO, the group that signed the accords with Israel, had already renounced violence in 1988. How did Israel expect to solve for the bloodshed without negotiating with the groups causing it?
Hamas is dedicated to the complete eradication of Jewish people.
You might be asking yourself, how could Israel negotiate with groups calling for its destruction? Weren't those groups opposed to negotiations? On June 1, 1988, Hamas leaders Mahmoud al-Zahar and Ibrahim al-Yazuri traveled from Gaza to Tel Aviv to meet with Yitzhak Rabin, then Israeli Minister of Defense. They presented Rabin with a plan to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel had to declare its intention to withdraw from the occupied territories. Then, it had to transfer authority of the territories to a neutral party, such as the UN, the European Common Market, the Arab League, or the Organization of African States. Israel also had to release all Palestinian detainees and allow the Palestinians to name their representatives without Israeli interference. Then, Israel and the Palestinians would negotiate final status issues. Hamas put a peaceful framework in place to solve the conflict. Negotiations must therefore include all parties to the armed conflict, especially the ones engaged in the arms part of the conflict. Hamas and Islamic Jihad cannot be left out of the peace talks, nor can other armed groups like the Lion's Den or the Jenin Brigades. The best way to guarantee the failure of a future peace process is to exclude political and military groups party to the conflict. Problem number 2. Israel was both party to the agreement and the enforcer of the agreement. The Israel-Palestine conflict involves weak political and military groups of stateless people on the one hand, and a strong state with a powerful military on the other hand. What is needed in such an environment is a neutral third party to ensure mutual compliance. During the Oslo Process, the United States was neither neutral nor did it exert enough power ensuring mutual compliance. In fact, during the 2000 and 2001 negotiations, documents were presented to the Palestinian negotiating team from the American diplomats, with the notes of the Israeli diplomatic team accidentally left in the margins. In other words, the Israelis and Americans collaborated on establishing a position that would be handed to the Palestinian team for review. The most powerful country in the world was acting on behalf of the side that already had all the power and leverage in the negotiations. The result was, Israel decided how to interpret the rules of engagement and insisted on retaining the right to interpret the rules of engagement because it could, because it had all the power. We know this because Israeli leaders have admitted it in a 2001 leaked recording. What happened with the Oslo Accords? I was asked about the Oslo Accords before the election in 1996. Will you fulfill them? I gave my own interpretation to the agreement in such a way that will allow me to stop the race back towards the 1967 borders. How did we do it? Nobody defined what military facilities are, so I also defined them as being security zones. The entire Jordan Valley, for me, is a military facility. And then Netanyahu, as he himself confesses in the leaked recording, refused to sign the Hebron Accords of 1997 unless both Arafat and U.S. Secretary of State Warren were to sign a document conceding that Israel and Israel alone gets to define what a military facility is. Netanyahu had exercised his veto power on the entire Oslo process to preserve his ability to define how the terms of the accords were allowed to be interpreted. This guaranteed their failure. Problem number 3. Israel and the Palestinians never had equal seats at the negotiating table. The Israeli negotiators enjoyed all the rights and privileges afforded to them by the State of Israel, especially freedom of movement. Meanwhile, the Palestinian negotiators were subjected to Israeli occupation, closure, harassment, and humiliation at military checkpoints and lockdowns. Meetings between Palestinian Authority representatives and Israeli officials took place in Tel Aviv in 2000 and 2001. And so Palestinian Authority officials would have to drive from Ramallah to Tel Aviv and thus pass through Israeli checkpoints. Diana Buttu recalls that nearly every time they would pass, the Israeli military would hold up very senior members of the Palestinian delegation for hours at checkpoints. Old men left in the sun for hours, having their permits inspected by 19-year-old Israeli soldiers. This was standard operating procedure. And all of this begs the question, how can you negotiate with a state that has its foot on your neck? Instead, what is needed is a process that treats Israelis and Palestinians equally. This is the crux of the matter, or at least, that's what Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh said in 2006. It's too bad no one took him seriously. Little will change for the Palestinians under Olmert's plan. Our land will still be occupied and our people enslaved and oppressed by the occupying power. So we will remain committed to our struggle to get back our lands and our freedom. Peaceful means will do if the world is willing to engage in a constructive and fair process in which we and the Israelis are treated as equals.